Welcome everybody to this webinar today with Mark Linkson, who's going to present to us on the theme of the Indigenous Science Network. Before we begin, I'm going to ask David Maloney to say a few words of acknowledgement of country and to share a short reflection. Over to you, David.
Thanks,
share
Stefan.
the screen.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bunurong people and the traditional custodians of all the lands we're meeting on, where we meet this evening, and to acknowledge our gratitude that we share this land today and the gifts that the Indigenous people offer us, our sorrow for the cost of that sharing, and I've just lost the prayer, Stefan, and our hope anyway in the reconciliation that might come. And I'm sorry, Stefan, the reflection, the prayer you gave me has disappeared because I've got on my screen, you've taken over.
Yes, there it is. Can you see it now? There
it is, yeah. Can everyone see that?
Should be able to. It's shared, I think. Yeah.
This is a prayer from John Humphreys, I think, from the Uniting Church. God of all, watcher and dreamer of all people, source of care, compassion and justice, keeper. The story of the first people shines bright in this land. For tens of thousands of years, the light burns strong. Deep culture, deep language, deep spirituality, efficient technology, sustainable living, like an extension of the Garden of Eden. Then things changed, whether well-meaning or ill-meaning, whether selfish or ignorant. The coming of subsequent people to this land has wrought wrong. Harm has been done, right left undone. And the first peoples have suffered and continue to suffer. Though the story is not all bad and there is good within it, with courage we face the truths that are saddening and upsetting. We give thanks for the first people of this land who recognise now their ancient sovereignty. We celebrate their wisdom. We seek to learn from their custodianship. We're sorry for the loss of land, language, culture and story. We're sorry for the suffering. We are thankful for those who work together, who listen to each other with courage and respect, and seek to work together in reconciliation. Help us to be such people. May we open ourselves to the truth, both good and ill, and commit to working and walking together with courage, that we might walk together reconciled to a better future for all people. This we pray. Amen.
Thanks very much, David. Now I'd like to introduce Mark, who I've known for well over 30 years, since we were together in a movement called the Young Christian Workers. Mark was in Adelaide, I was in Melbourne at that time, or possibly Sydney. We've worked on a number of projects here and there over that time and reconnected recently. And I learnt of his work with the Indigenous Science Network, which took place, in fact, over probably the last 30 years. I'm sure Michael will explain to you in much greater detail. But he was teaching in a number of schools across the northern part of Australia, the Northern Territory, North Queensland and the Torres Strait Islands. He also taught for a couple of years in Somalia, and through all that experience, he's gained a lot of knowledge and has had an integral role with the Indigenous Science Network over many of those years. So thanks very much for joining us today, Mark, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Over to you, Mark.
No worries. Thanks a lot, Steph. I'll just get my vision up. So hopefully everyone can see the title page for my presentation tonight. It is the National Science Week here in Australia, and I don't know whether Steph meant to coincide it with Science Week, but it worked out really well because that's going on all this week and into next week. And I'm very thankful for Steph's idea to do this. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge the country that I'm on at the moment, which is associated with the Gimway Wallaburra clan of the Adinji peoples. That's south of the Brown River here in Cairns of Gimway. And then more northerly is belongs to the Yirraganji peoples And their name actually has gone towards that terrible little jellyfish, the Irukandji. That's where the name comes from. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to past, present, future traditional custodians and elders of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia and all First Nations peoples across the world. We celebrate and promote the continuation of their cultural, spiritual and educational practices. So what I'd like to do today with you all is talk a bit about myself as a teacher and where I worked, which is sort of a precursor to how I ended up getting involved with the Indigenous Science Network, and then to explore a little bit about the concept of Indigenous science, because it is still sadly contentious in some places. This came from Corey Tutt's Deadly Science. He put it up on Twitter today or yesterday. Just a reminder that, in fact, the first scientists are the First Nations people of this country, and it's not to be forgotten. And the job of my network, the Indigenous Science Network, is to promote Indigenous science and education with the wider Australian community, and that's now spilled over into the global community, which is quite exciting. As someone that's worked in Indigenous communities for a very long time and with Indigenous students in the last 10, 15 years as a teacher educator, it's always important that we share a little bit about ourselves before we start the academic treatise, because it doesn't really matter how wonderfully informed you are and how well organised you are if you don't first of all, open a connection at a personal level with your students, with the people that you're dealing with, and there cannot be really a good understanding of who you are and why you have the ability to stand here and have the opinions that you do. So I'm just going to quickly give you a little précis about myself. The first Linkson to arrive in this country was in the 1850s, I believe. So apparently I'm the 6th generation. Which of course is nothing compared to the generations of our First Nations peoples. And if there are any First Nations peoples in the room tonight, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you as well. Yeah, middle class, I guess. Love the ABC. I'm sadly a boomer, which isn't a good thing these days, but I'd like to think I'm still doing something useful for society. I was originally from Adelaide, Kaurna country, and I support the Crows in the AFL, and I used to support Glenelg in the SANFL, but a sad story these days. And I did have a Catholic schooling, which is why I got mixed up in the Young Christian Workers. And for me, it was my parents. How they afforded sending 5 kids to Catholic schools, we've still not really been able to work that out, because they never had a lot of money. So, yeah, I don't know what they were doing to manage it, but good on them. My experience with the Young Christian Workers was basically one of waking up to the fact that the world is not a pretty place, that the world can be a pretty ugly place sometimes, and that we've got to look out for each other. So social justice and unions were a big part of my life right up until I retired 3 years ago. I was always a union rep in whatever workplace I was in. And more recently, I've been informed that I became a culture broker when Dr. Michael Mitchie, who originated the Indigenous Science Network over 20 years ago, did a PhD and used me as one of his informants. And apparently, because I'd worked in so many places and I'd been presenting Western cultural ideas to Indigenous people and other peoples, as you can see, it was Ethiopia that I was in, not Somalia, but close, and United Arab Emirates. So it's been an interesting journey, and one where I've been on a very big learning curve, that's for sure. What's a culture broker? Well, apparently it's someone who advocates for change. So I would have thought that's a change agent, but you got to throw the culture in there as well, because that's what I was doing across cultures. Just a few brief pictures of where I've been. What Airport Keats was very formative in my life. I was there for 6 years. It was my second full-time job as a teacher, because I started off as a public servant many years before that. And I was very lucky to end up working as an adult educator and took a mob of artists to the United States, which was one of the highlights of my career, really. And seeing those fellas, here they are over in this bottom left-hand corner. They could sing, they could dance, they could paint. Renaissance men, the whole lot of them. And I always love this picture of Adrian and his mates umpiring the footy at Port Keats. Adrian, this fellow here with the cigarette in his mouth, we worked together for a couple of years. He was my teacher assistant. And I believe he's still coaching footy in Port Keats, so good on him. That's my year 5 class in 1989 or 1990. Oh boy, it's a while ago now. And culture was a huge part of what happened at Whatever. These pictures are for public consumption. There's no problem with that. This one, top right-hand corner, was the last day of a men's ceremony. And if you look very carefully, there are young men crawling between the legs of the older men, and the young men are covered in bronze-coloured ochre. And at the end of the line, their mothers are sitting, waiting for them to come back to them through the legs of the warriors. And when they get to their mothers, the mothers wail and cry. I was extremely lucky to be able to see the end of that ceremony. I was also in the Torres Strait for a couple of years. I was at Thursday Island, Warrabir Island and Purima. And Purima's got this Anglican church, which they built out of cement, but it never got finished because the island's made of sand. And so the concrete church was always about to fall down, but 50 years later, it's still standing, abandoned. I had some students at the school and some students doing RATIP, which is Indigenous Teacher Education, run by the Queensland Department of Education. This picture down the bottom right-hand corner, that's my wife Lisa walking around the island. We used to walk around the island after work. It would take us about 45 minutes. That was our world. Lisa didn't like getting in small planes, so she stayed on that island for almost a whole year without getting off it again. She couldn't stand those flights. I used to get off a bit. RATIP, Indigenous Teacher Education, a huge part of what I did. I started off in the Torres Strait and then I came to Cairns and joined TAFE and worked there as a teacher and lecturer in education for almost 15 or 16 years. I think I had two goes at that up until 2006, and that image there is, I think, my Cert 4s from about 2005, maybe. And this image up here, they're my diploma students. I taught the diploma for about 10 years, and that's up at Rex Lookout when we were on an excursion. Really loved working with Indigenous students and learning so much about culture and also sharing what I knew from all my experiences. I nicked off overseas from 06 to 08, ended up in Ethiopia. And this is the second school, that's Dandy Bottle School, which was a combined campus of primary and high school. And I was the deputy principal for primary, I think. So that was a huge learning curve. The shot here was at the first school where I was teaching English to year 4s. And I'm not looking very happy in that picture, I think, because the kids decided to go a little bit crazy when I asked if I could get a photo. But that's okay. Everyone used to wear waistcoats, and I had to wear a white jacket thingy there, so I looked like a scientist. But all the teachers in Ethiopia had to wear those outfits. Religion, really big part of Ethiopia. Wonderful example to the rest of the world, actually, Ethiopia, because of course it's 50% Christian and 50% Muslim, and they get on fantastically. So the world should really take a leaf out of their book on how they conduct themselves over there. Sadly, they are having a bit of infighting at the moment. This is the main road to the school where I was at for the second year in Addis Ababa. As you can see, it's just a dirt track, and when it rained, it was a mud track. But that didn't stop people from wearing their best outfits and getting into school. This was a Christian festival. It might have been Easter. I forget what it was, but Meskel Square is the biggest square in Ethiopia. It fits about 3 million people. And there were about 3 million people here that day when I went there, and it got quite scary because you're in this massive, massive crowd. and you really can't control where you're going to go. You just have to go with the flow. Down here in Sharjah, United Arab Emirates, there for a little while, and once again learning a whole lot about another culture. So I've been very fortunate in where I've been and what I've done. And for the last, quite a number of years, I got involved in Indigenous science through what I did in the Northern Territory, which was to produce Indigenous curriculum support materials in science. And the first document that I produced in 96 or 97 was looking at landforms, and had a beautiful little poem written by a Yolngu girl, which talks about the fact that land is my mother, and land is a really important concept for Indigenous people. And key ideas for this science, this unit of science. And third key idea, Aboriginal people believe that landforms are created by religious events in the dream time. You may wonder how on earth you can have that as a key idea in a science, in a unit of science, but this was 25 years ago. But times were changing then, and there still was a lot of pushback that you could possibly put something like this into a science unit. But we won the day because Indigenous people were slowly getting their voice. And the Northern Territory Board of Studies had an Aboriginal advisory board who used to make sure that whatever we were doing for Indigenous schools was appropriate. And of course, what could be more appropriate than recognising the value of First Nations beliefs? And that's what we did. So that was the first lesson in Activity 1. And the second part of Activity 1 is where we get a little bit more Western. But in doing so, we had to make sure that we let people know there were cultural considerations. So, because these documents were written really weren't written for Indigenous teachers, they were written for young neophyte white teachers out in the remotes in the Northern Territory who had no idea of what they were walking into. So cultural consideration, the Indigenous Australian view that landforms are created by religious events in the dream time should not be used as evidence that Western science is mistaken. Of course, I put that on its head. You might think that's the other way around. The Western scientific view that landforms are created by sun, wind and water should not be used as evidence that Indigenous beliefs are mistaken. And so we are right away saying don't attempt to compare or judge one belief system against the other. And this is something that through all the years that I've been working in this area has been really important. The fact that we're not in competition. Both types of science can exist and both have value within the cultures that they come from. So I've just thrown this one in here as an example of an Indigenous science. This one obviously from India, somewhere in Asia. Just a reminder that there was incredible knowledge and it's been around for a very, very long time. There's nothing new about maths, there's nothing new about geometry or engineering or physics. It's been known for a very long time, and this is something that's that I'll be giving you some more examples of as we go through the session. My time at TAFE, the last part of our diploma, there was a new unit called Support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children with Science Inquiry. And once again, we were looking at Western science, but also giving value to the Indigenous environmental knowledge or Indigenous science that First Nations people bring to the classroom. So Luke Briscoe, who runs Indigenous X, was quoted, reminding us again that Indigenous Australia has some of the world's earliest scientists who've witnessed major astronomical and catastrophic events. And those events have survived in the stories that are passed down through generations. And in fact, we know that where I live here in Cairns, Gimoy, that the mob out at Yarrabah They have stories from when the sea level was a lot lower than it is today. And they have stories of country which is now underwater. And the Western scientists will tell you, yes, that's correct. But indeed, there was a lot more land out from east of Cairns hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. And the amazing thing is, of course, that knowledge is contained in the oral traditions of the mob from Yarrabah. So why am I running this network? I'm not Black. And as a non-Indigenous person, I'm always acutely aware of the fact that I've got my name against something that should, by all rights, be done by an Indigenous person. Well, it's just the way it's happened. The person that started the network, Mike Mitchie, who started it in 1998, he was my boss at the Board of Studies in the Northern Territory. And when I started doing all this Indigenous science stuff and really pushing it hard through my work with the communities, a light bulb must have gone on in Mike's head, and he could suddenly see the value for Indigenous students of Indigenous science. And so we had a meeting at NTU, which is now Charles Darwin Uni, and met a whole bunch of like-minded people. And after that meeting, I think it was Canasta that was on, Asira was on, he decided to set up this network. And he did that for over 20 years, I think. Dear old Mike's getting pretty old and he's not able to continue on. And I retired a couple of years ago, and I got under him and said, well, you know, why don't I have a go? Because we used to work together and I thought it'd be nice to have a go. So that's what's happened. It's a passion project, really, the Indigenous Science Network. We're not connected to any institution, we're not connected to anybody. It's just something that Mike did with a whole lot of cooperation and a whole lot of people that got involved through his mailing list. And I have now continued on, starting in 2020, and I've extended the reach of the network through Twitter and Facebook, so that we now have about 500 people on our Excel sheet with email addresses that are part of the network. And we've got almost 2,000 Twitter followers and 1,500 on Facebook. So this is what the bulletin looked like back in 2007. It was just on Mike's webpage. But now we've got, on the right, we've got this PDF, which you can download from ACI. I managed to get the Australian Council for Education Research to agree to host our bulletins and also to give us some pages. So we have a proper website, which is brilliant. And in putting the renewed Indigenous Science Network together, I made sure to involve First Nations peoples. And I have a group of 7 First Nations peoples, most from Australia, Aotearoa, and one from Canada, and an African fellow, I think he's living in New York now. So it's great that I was able to garner that interest and support. And for me, really important, because I'm, as I said earlier, acutely aware of being a non-Indigenous person running a network which is meant for the benefit of Indigenous peoples. This is what our webpage looks like now. And over on the left, you see the menu there. And the First Nations editorial board is the 4th item over there. So people can see and read the biographies of the people who get to look at the bulletin before it gets distributed via the email messages to my network members, and then via Facebook and Twitter. So what is science? Unfortunately, science, from my perspective, it's all relative to who you are. A lot of Western empiricists would be pretty hot on this and say, well, there's only one science. That's the Western science. That's the science that involves a number of steps, hypotheses, observations, repeatable experimentation, blah, blah, blah. But I've learned from a long time ago that although that Western science is science, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And that's because science is the way societies seek to explain how and why the natural environment works. And each society has its own way of doing it. So science reflects culture. And I'd get a lot of, you're kidding, from a lot of the hardline empiricists out there. But we strongly believe that you cannot divorce science from the people who make it. Maybe it's a radical idea, I don't know. But this network has been going for over 23 years now, on the understanding that there's no such thing as a pure Western empirical science. There is, in fact, more than one way to look at a situation. There's more than one way to understand how the world works. That's the famous dark emu, which is very important to many First Nations peoples in Australia. And on the left-hand side is an image just from our most recent bulletin, the August bulletin I just put out last week, which is showing some images related to a Canadian First Nations mob. Well, you're going to talk about worldviews. You're going to be thinking about culture, and that link there goes to a video, but I'm not going to worry about going to that video now. But Steph tells me that he'll make this presentation available to you all. So there's a whole bunch of links in here if you want to follow that up later on. Basically, your Western worldview is all about domination. It's all about getting ahead. It's all about getting to the top, using everything possible to get there, having a hierarchy of who's important, starting at the bottom where the ants and the earth is, you know, to be used, and right at the top of the triangle would be us, I suppose. Indigenous worldviews are a lot different. They don't have a hierarchy. They believe that all parts of the environment have equal weight and equal value. I'm not going to try and explain much more about that, but I'm sure that every one of you in the room, having come to this session, that you've already got some understanding of the differing worldviews of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So one thing I did with Mike Mitchie is try and explain what the difference was. And what we came up with was that the primary aim of Western science is to progress society through understanding and control of the mystery of natures, as against Indigenous science, which is all about maintaining society through celebrating and cooperating with the mysteries of nature. It's these ideas, as I've said here, this was from a book that we put out in '99, generalised characteristics, but you can see that there is some truth in all these. I'm not going to read through them, but you can see that Western worldview is all about the individual. It's all about competition, as against the Indigenous worldview, which is all about the community and cooperation. Here's a similar graphic, but it's from 2021. Mibu Fisher, who works for CSIRO, an Indigenous woman who's part of our network. She put this in a paper, and it has some more concepts. And if you get some time to have a bit of a look through that, you'll see that she's put in the Venn diagram things that relate to both Western and Indigenous ways of seeing and doing. Beautiful image here, showing how Indigenous science has within it traditional ecological knowledge, and then it falls within Indigenous knowledge. This comes from a First Nations mob in Canada, and but it really can, there's a lot of alignment with all First Nations peoples, the way that has been pictured. And it's a very beautiful image, which was very much shared on Facebook. People really enjoyed seeing that. Reciprocal relationships. Reciprocity is so important in Indigenous cultures. And this is just a graphic reminding people of what's important. That was part of that project where I got the previous image. And something which struck me as quite in a similar vein, I went to this STEM summit back in 2020, and one of the presenters there had the key points that Western businesses focus on taking from the earth, whereas Aboriginal businesses tend to focus on replenishing. I thought that was quite nice. So for me, I consider the Western ways of viewing the world are neither the only way nor necessarily the best. And I understand that people in different cultures have alternative ways of making sense of the world. So what are the evidence for the First Nation science from long ago? There's a beautiful list of them right here. Physics, astronomy, maths, navigation, land care, chemistry, warfare, all these areas are important to Indigenous peoples, and they have been experts in all these areas for a very long time. In Australia, fish traps. They reckon this one's been going for 40,000 years. That's at Brewarrina, which is very famous. And there are a lot of these, a lot of similar. And Stefan was just telling me before we started that he was involved in measuring and surveying a fish trap in Western Victoria when he first started going to university. So Indigenous mobs been in this country for 40,000 years. How do you be successful if you don't understand the environment, if you don't understand how to use it, if you don't understand how it works? You can't. There's incredible depth of knowledge about the environment that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have. Colonial art's an interesting discussion. Now, Bill Gigacz has this wonderful book called The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia. And he came out about 4 years before Clark Emu and Michael Bruce. And he used to look at the unnatural plant patterns in the colonial art and wonder what was going on there. Why would they do that? You see this image here with the beautiful open plains, which you won't see anymore now. It's all overgrown. And in fact, there's a quote here about a gentleman's park in England. That's what it looked like. Now, Australia doesn't look like that anymore. And the reason why it was is because First Nations peoples were actively looking after the country for a very, very long time. And Eugene von Gerard has got this image which he painted in 1858. And then he takes, Bill Gigacz takes a picture of that same spot. And you can see the massive difference that no longer is there openings through the bush. You couldn't run through that bush. This is very, very overgrown now. Another image to show how long Indigenous science has been going. The Mayan cultures in Central America have some fantastic scientific and cultural constructions which have been around for a very long time. Where are we now? Recognition by agents of the dominant culture of the importance of Indigenous science. Now, of course, when I started doing it in the Territory in '96, it was pretty unusual. There wasn't a lot of it around, but it's become more and more acceptable now, the idea of Indigenous science. This is from the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. They have an Indigenous Science, Technology and Society unit. So that's part of the university there. You've got the Bureau of Meteorology here in Australia has had for quite a few years now an Indigenous weather knowledge page where they show you those beautiful circular calendars of the weather and the foods that are available in those times of the year. I don't have an image of the circular calendars, but I hope everyone knows what I'm talking about there. They're beautiful. CSIRO has got a very strong Indigenous interest. They have a page of Indigenous science. So it's right there. So those empiricists that don't like the idea of Indigenous science, well, you go tell the CSIRO, because they've got a web page which has a whole bunch of information about Indigenous science. I'm not going to press the link that would take me there, but we're going to run out of time, I know. So I'm just going to keep talking. David Unayapon was an absolute polymath, an absolutely brilliant Indigenous man from South Australia. And he was an Indigenous scientist, but he was doing Western science. And he invented an improved handpiece for sheep shearing. Unfortunately, Of course, because he was black, he couldn't get any money. So somebody made a lot of money out of Unicon's invention of the circular orbital handpiece for shearing sheep. And there's now a whole building at the University of South Australia, which is named after David Unicon. So he is very much in the mainstream now, or his recognition is anyway. The Mint, the Australian Mint, has put out these fantastic commemorative coins in 2021, which have these most beautiful images of Indigenous astronomy beliefs and constellations. The big one on the right here, that is from the Torres Strait, one of their very important stories of Bidem, I think, the shark. Down here on the left bottom is the Seven Sisters, which is a hugely significant dreaming story, which runs right across Australia. And there is the Dark Union in the top left-hand corner. These are beautiful looking coins. I wouldn't mind getting some, but I think they got sold out very quickly. Another example of the mainstreaming of Indigenous knowledge is the fact that last November, the President of the United States agreed that Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge needed to be a part of whatever happened with the United States government. So what a breath of fresh air it was being Trump out of there. And in fact, the person that runs the department that looks after the estates in the United States is actually a Native American woman. So absolutely fantastic. There is another group called the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network, which is run out of I think Colorado, by Colorado. Or maybe she's not in Colorado, that's just the name. But once again, showing how on her page, Western scientists are recognising the cultural importance of Indigenous science. So, and her site's been going for a very long time. John Monash University now runs an Indigenous science course. More examples of Indigenous science. These fantastic bark funnel fish traps. Now, I'm going to tell you a funny story about this one. You may not see it straight away, but there's a man sitting in each of these semicircular constructions, and they're sitting in there and they're just collecting the fish as they come through the funnel that's been constructed. And anthropologists looking at this in the 1930s said, well, here's another typical example of how slack the Aborigines are. Have a look at them. They're expending no energy whatsoever in order to collect these fish. Now, you know, racism rears its ugly head, and it always will if we're talking about Indigenous issues, but it's quite hilarious how the scientists of the day decided this was an example of showing the lethargy of Indigenous people. Quite appalling, but in fact it shows the absolute brilliance that they can sit there and gather enough fish for a week in an hour. An elder in Arnhem Land is demonstrating to some students how to catch fish using the anesthetic properties of particular plants. Very clever. The world's oldest stone axes were found in Kakadu, and no other culture had such axes for another 20,000 years. Don't worry about wheels. I used to be a geological cartographer. That was my first job in Adelaide. So I was quite intrigued to see that the Inuit have got these fantastic wooden carvings, which are in fact navigational maps. So what they do is they can use these carvings in order to understand the ins and outs of the coastline as they are navigating their way up and down Greenland. Absolutely brilliant. Snow goggles from the Inupiaq people, who would be a part of Nunavut, which is in northern Canada. And these snow goggles, circa 1890, in 1910. So they certainly last. There's no doubt about it. Brilliant, brilliant science, a brilliant invention. And here's an image of someone from Nunavut wearing these snow goggles. And apparently the oldest pair dates back to 1200 AD. Absolutely incredible. This was considered a joke. There was a story going around that polar bears were hitting walruses on the head by throwing rocks at them. But in fact, it's true. And Western scientists had to what's the expression I'm looking for? Put up and shut up? I don't know. In fact, it was happening. And this is an engraving from 1865, which shows a polar bear throwing a rock at the walrus. And because it just seemed so unbelievable, Western science couldn't believe it was possible. But there's been recent research that, in fact, it does happen. It is happening. The Indigenous scientists were correct. The Inuit knowledge was great. Something else that happens in this space is that there is a lot of chatter about the value of Indigenous versus Western science. And it's something that in our bulletins over the last year and a half, we've been looking at quite closely, because unfortunately, there was something that happened in New Zealand last year, where a whole bunch of academics decided to sledge Maori science. Now, this guy, Professor Rangi Matuma Mua, is an Indigenous scientist, he's a Maori scientist, and he's reminding people, you don't navigate the expansive ocean on myths and legends. You don't come here and apply a very detailed and reasonably specific vision of time, thrive, and sink yourself into the natural rhythm of the environment without having science. But because it's wrapped up in cultural beliefs, even in spirituality, the way we view our science, Western practitioners have difficulties understanding the depth and richness of Indigenous people's base. So this was the article that caused all the kerfuffle in defence of science, letter to the editor, in the NZ Listener, and these 7 academics signed it, and there was a lot of blowback from the Vice Chancellor of the University of Auckland. The university has deep respect for Mataranga Maori as considered a valuable knowledge system. It's not at odds with Western empirical science. They are complementary. There's much to learn. And Dr. Tara McAllister, who's Maori, rejected the inaccurate assertion that my tupuna did not do science. We did not navigate Aotearoa on myths and legend. We did not live successfully in balance with the environment without science. It's the same with the Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples who've lived successfully for so long. Maori were the first scientists in Aotearoa. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the first scientists in Australia. Bradley Mogridge is a fascinating fellow. He's a hydrogeologist and also a Kamilaroi man, and he's been working in environmental science for quite a long time. He's now set up a group for all Indigenous scientists to join in Australia, which I am helping him to publicise. But once again, he's explaining in these quotes how, of course, Indigenous people in this country were scientists, and it's just ridiculous to suggest otherwise. Nipping back to New Zealand, this is a rather lovely video item, which if you do grab this PowerPoint office, you can have a look at that, or it's in the link is in the bulletin from, I think, November or August last year, I forget, but it's great seeing the utter grace with which the Māori academics talk about the attacks on their culture and their science. It almost makes you cry to see how graceful they are, because there's so much shit that gets thrown at them, and still they'll get up in public and they'll listen to the points of view that the academics are throwing at them, and then they'll try to explain that in fact there's a little bit of misunderstanding. Michael Fletcher is one of our First Nations editorial board here at the network. And when all this hoo-ha was going on, he wrote this Twitter here, which is quite good fun, saying that to people saying myths and stories don't have a place in science, this is not an atom. This is an inaccurate representation of an atom. We can't represent an atom accurately, so we use a stylized version. This myth allows us to actually understand the world. Someone else was talking about a Maori student, or Pacifica. He's doing his PhD at Victoria University. Taufa used both traditional and Polynesian and European science traditions. Taufa discovered unique and possibly medical useful molecules in Tongan seas fungus. So the knowledge that is always there in our Indigenous peoples, our First Nations peoples, is so important. It needs to be recognised, it needs to be shared. And Michael Fletcher is quoted down here again. The gatekeeping of science is moronic. Who says stories aren't tested and refined using science? We use story to convey knowledge acquired through observation, prediction, experimentation. Just because it's communicated differently doesn't invalidate it as robust and scientific. And there's another quote on all the hoo-ha, but I don't want us to run out of time because I'd love to have a few questions before we finish up. And the NZ Science Review in 2019 actually had the final word, even though this debate was in 2021, because it all comes down once again to where you come from and what's important in your life. And so what that means is there's possibly no way to resolve the debate that goes on about Western versus Indigenous science. Professor Liz McKinley is the chair of our advisory board here at the network, and she, I actually met her over 20 years ago in New Zealand, in Rotorua, where she was working with Mike and Mike Mitchie, and ended up being his PhD supervisor. She's now in Melbourne, and she's been a fantastic supporter of the renewed network, and I thank her very much for her energy and her participation. And she's just talking about the fact that Indigenous science is not something from the past, talking about cultural burning, which is now being used and developed right now here in contemporary times, and she was quoting Michael Sean Fletcher. Look, as climatic conditions in Australia are changing, the knowledge adapts, so we are using old Indigenous knowledge and adapting it to different conditions to create new Indigenous knowledge. This shows not only the versatility of Indigenous knowledge, but also shows it undergoes continual renewal and growth guided by our cultural protocols and law. Jessica Hernandez has written a fantastic book, and she's globally very important in the Indigenous science space. A lot of students of colour who are weaved out of STEM as a major discipline and think they can no longer become a scientist. I remind them that science is based on inquiry and observation, and that scientific methods can be learned outside of the classroom, anywhere. You don't have to have a laboratory to do science. Got a whole heap of resources on Indigenous science, further reading. This is a really important little book for primary school kids, which Corey Tuck, who runs Deadly Science, has put together recently, Deadly Inventions and Innovations from Australia's First People. That's Jessica and her fresh banana leaves, healing Indigenous landscapes through Indigenous science. Corey Tutt again with Australian Geographic, his Deadly Science initiative, has a whole bunch of books on aspects of science. Victor Stefansson is really important in the cultural burning space in this country, and he's written a picture book about looking after the country with fire. Fantastic book here on the first astronomers, which has a whole heap of stories from Indigenous elders, Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal. That painting on the front cover is done by a Torres Strait Islander man, brilliant guy. Carly Noon and Crystal Di Napoli are both Indigenous astronomers who are very active in social media. Both very clever women. Look out for them. They wrote this book for Margot O'Neill in her First Knowledges series on astronomy. And she's also got Country and Design. I think there's about 5 or 6 of these books that have come out or coming out. Country is with Bill Gamage that I talked about earlier, and Bruce Pascoe, who did Dark Emu. Alison Page and Paul Memmer did Design. Lastly, the South Australian Science Teachers Association Journal last year, November 2021, did a whole issue on Indigenous science, and this issue is available for free to anyone that can find the link, and I can give you the link if you would like it. Thanks for your attendance tonight, everyone. Hope that was useful.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was fantastic. Yeah, great to hear of your experience in those different places, and also your role, pioneering role, I would even say, in helping set up or disseminate the knowledge of Indigenous science in Australia. So really great to hear all that. I think we have quite a number of people in the audience still. So yeah, over to whoever would like to jump in with a comment. I'll have a look in the chat and see if anybody's already put a question there, but feel free. I cannot see everybody on the screen, so feel free to jump in if you do have a question or a comment. Yeah. I think I see something from Wayne McGough about the Mulloon Institute. Do you want to say something about that, Wayne?
Off mute. The Mulloon Institute have been, through one of our members alerted to us, they've been using Aboriginal technology and science to translate it into use for farm management in terms of water conservation, tree plantation in a particular way, well beyond the fish traps, because, and I'm just wondered if there's any connection between Mark's work, Mark's group and them.
No, there's not. But there is so much going on in this country, and every 3 months I put out this bulletin, and my goodness, there is just so much material being created and produced within that short amount of time. And I'm not across everything that's happening, and that's why I'm always asking members to send me things that they come across so that I can promote it.
Are you aware, one of our members, Rob Rowley, alerted us to a farm down near Mortlake, which is planted on an Aboriginal design where the trees are planted in a circular fashion. Anyway, and they've trained the cattle and so on to use it that way. Anyway, the temperature goes in at 27 degrees on the other, on one side, and comes out as 23. And he and others have been working to try and get a link of these farms across the southern Grampians, because with the ice sheet melting in Antarctica, the winds that used to be rain-bearing are now dry winds that have basically killed off the koalas in Garrywood, in the Grampians. And but if they were able to get these farms to cooperate, that are still owned by a chain of families, they would. It would be one way that using Aboriginal technology to actually cut the heat that's going in up to the Garrywood or the Grampians. So lots of, and water management as well, lots of things going on.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, if you feel like dropping me a line with a bit of that information, I'd love to put it in the next bulletin, Wayne.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? I see that we have a number of people who do have experience in this area, so feel free to jump in and share some of your own knowledge and experience or comments.
Hi, I'm just going to put something in the link from the Australian Council of Deans of Science University. So I'm part of a university, working out how best to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into curriculum. We're at quite an early stage. There's fantastic resources that I'm just sending a link for. And I'd like to also reiterate that there's been so much positive discussion on Indigenous knowledge systems, particularly during National Science Week. There's a fantastic array of programs that are really not just celebrating it, but embracing it and respecting it. And so I'm a bit biased because I actually run the Indigenous Science Experience at Redfern, but there are great resources. But I'm personally struggling with, I'm at a school of natural sciences where we have many disciplines, including physiology and genetics and chemistry and so on, and actually trying to get respectful breadth of incorporation of Indigenous knowledge across our units is something that is intriguing me.
Thanks, Joanne. Do you want to respond, Mark?
Yes, there are a lot of events in National Science Week here in Australia which have an Indigenous perspective. And if you'd like to see a list of them, just get a hold of our August bulletin. I didn't, as you can see, that PowerPoint was chock full of stuff. So there is a lot going on. And if you have an interest in following up with actual activities and events which relate to Indigenous, ecological and scientific knowledge, then yeah, check out the programs. Just get on the website.
Thank you very much. It was an inspiring presentation. I attended today, so it's Trish Gillard talking. I attended today at Melbourne Uni. It was a wonderful workshop, and Indigenous science was so inspiring. Yeah, so I was very, very grateful, and also grateful for your amazing presentation too. So thank you.
No worries, Trish. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, I guess for some of us, it's a bit out of our, even though we appreciate it, it's a bit out of our immediate knowledge. So it's hard to know the questions to ask, I guess. But yeah, you mentioned that I went down, actually, when I was about 21, I went down to Budge Bim, I think it's called, down in the Western District of Victoria, where they did have those fish traps there. And at that time, you know, it was still kind of, speaking of myth, the myth was that Aboriginal people all lived as nomads and kind of wandered from place to place almost aimlessly. And kind of at that time, it was I guess I'm talking about for white people, I guess, it was a surprise to find villages of Indigenous people living there, which of course, unfortunately, have been destroyed. And later I learned, of course, you know, that a lot of the farming, which also wasn't recognised by Europeans, which was, as you say, a planned use of the land so that root crops would grow, and which were destroyed very quickly by the introduction of sheep, who compacted the soil. So, you know, I think there's really a lot we've got to pick up on and make amends for, really. Yeah. And I think the whole fire issue is, you know, I get frustrated every time I read reports of fires. You know, I come from Victoria, of those fires and the way those high-level fires are still being, you know, just burning every year, destroying rather than low-level burning, which preserves and promotes growth and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, there's still a long way to go, for sure.
Stefan, I'd like to say I from Sydney. I've had some, but very, very limited connections with our Indigenous people, and for a long while I've had a hunch, just a hunch, that there had to be a depth, that there had to be more and more to this, to our First Nation people that to know about. And so, Mark, your presentation has been a huge light for me and great relief and great excitement. So thank you very much.
No worries.
So, Mark, sorry, Boyd Lenny here. The Indigenous Education Network, you ever got the term right there?
Yep. Science.
Really fantastic that you've started the ball rolling with this and that you're getting a big groundswell behind you. Is this primarily aimed at getting appropriate education into schools and finding ways that we can respectfully collaborate with Indigenous traditional owners to get their information tabled alongside Western. There's a lot of interest, I suppose, with the Uluru Statement currently. What is an appropriate voice to Parliament that has value, that has meaning to the Indigenous people, as well as can dovetail into the Western culture, the Western, I suppose, political system in a meaningful way that has consequence. So I've been sort of trying to get my head around what the Indigenous education network is really for. And of course, it's a fantastic thing to bring people together around the table and start to have these conversations. I held back a little bit early on in your presentation. I really had to experience your presentation emotionally because I'm a very hard-headed imperialist, not imperialist, okay? So I did have to experience your talk emotionally and really understand and think of all of the examples that I've seen. But yeah, when schools are teaching language in remote communities, when schools are teaching respect for Indigenous cultures, everybody wins, in the way that in some ways in New Zealand, you referenced New Zealand a lot in your presentation, and New Zealand is a real, it's a benchmark country for having meaningful context for their Indigenous traditions, in that, everyone understands the haka, everyone understands a lot of the songs. We don't have that parallel here in Australia. So with your role in this network and obviously building it collaboratively, are you hoping to not only find better ways to teach Indigenous students the best information and the best science knowledge, but also to find appropriate uses for this very valuable information in more mainstream curriculums as well?
It's a good question.
Yeah, Boyd, there's a lot of good questions and comments in there.
Yeah, sorry, I run on a bit.
Yeah, sure did, mate. Look, I'm just the messenger. I don't really have an agenda apart from gathering all the items I can find that relate to the aims of the network. The aims of the network are basically promoting the idea of Indigenous science, promoting the idea of Indigenous education, and the fact that you've got to have allowance for culture in order for Indigenous kids to be successful. You can't just teach them like everybody else. This gathering tonight, yeah, it is lovely to get a few people together. I don't do this normally. I just normally sit here in my house in Cairns, and every 3 months I send out a bulletin, having a few messages go back and forth via email from myself and the First Nations editors. People are busy. People are so busy all the time. I mean, I've been out of the workforce now for 2 or 3 years, and but I still have a passion for for that area that I was working in. It's nice that I'm able to do this. No, I'm just here in order to gather the material. But what surprises me every couple of months is just how much more material there always is to be found. It's like worldwide, there just seems to be a massive upsweep in interest in the usefulness and of Indigenous knowledge and the recognition that it has value. And that's absolutely brilliant.
Well, my understanding of what we're trying to achieve with this partnership, with this collaboration, my understanding was always about how to teach kids better and how to get more appropriate ways of framing information to help them through the curricular system. But your presentation actually flipped the whole thing on its head and showed what amazing value there is in traditional knowledge and customs, and how many of them are completely appropriate to the modern curriculum system for all participants. And yeah, that recognition of, the value of our traditional knowledge is something that should really be shouted from the rooftops in all states. Because yeah, it's something that I think there's a bit of a turning point where people want to understand this. They want to have the open ears, and I suppose Australia traditionally, it's been so very brutal, to all people, but particularly our Indigenous peoples. And there's now an appetite to listen. There's this Western idea of understanding the harm we're doing, and it's gradually developed out of, I suppose, out of the 80s and 90s, and bullying's really being curbed to a degree. And I think there's an appetite now to try to put some of these things back the other way and reverse the flow, much the same way as now everyone's listening to traditional owners and trying to learn some of the better versions of burning practices and improve on those. But yeah, it was very exciting because what you've set out to do initially is to teach kids better. But your whole presentation just now actually reversed the flow in a way that really sparked me.
Yeah, thanks, Boyd. Yeah, it has been, it's sort of like an octopus. It just keeps growing more legs. There just seems to be so many tangents to the idea of Indigenous science, because it's holistic, you know, we don't compartmentalize. There's everything relates to everything. And that's why I wish my editors would sometimes edit a bit tougher. It was 170 pages in the last bulletin, but I think it was all useful stuff.
Fantastic, mate. Thank you very much. No, keep going, buddy. The world will use you even in retirement as much as we can. Thank you.
Cheers. Be nice to get paid, but that's okay.
All right. Yeah, we'd all love that. Yeah. Well, look, I think we've been going nearly 75 minutes now. So
David's got a question.
Anybody else got any last questions? One or two last questions or comments?
Yeah, Stefan, I was going to just a couple of comments. That firstly, if the Western science empiricists get too righteous, there was a program on the ABC National 18 months ago talking about the translation of scientific papers from papers to actual publications, and the percentage of those in which possibilities became probabilities or certainties was extraordinarily high. So there's a question of integrity in this competitive individualistic science, Western science. So it was a tonic to hear, you know, another perspective. And the other comment I had was that I've done a lot of history work around the north and west of Melbourne, the outskirts, and that example you used before of just like a gentleman's park was used all the time in the area between, say, the Merry Creek and Moonee Ponds Creek, and then also up around the beginnings of the Campaspe River as people were heading off to the goldfields. The people were just filled with wonder at the beauty of those open red gum woodlands that had been burnt by the Aborigines. And so I don't think it's very scientific, but just the joy and the wonder was, you know, of just discovering this utopia. You know, what must have been like for the people who lived there originally.
Absolutely right. Mm.
Great. Well, if you do want to make a last comment or question, please be forthright because I cannot see you all. Anyway, I think possibly David's helped us reach a conclusion there. So unless anybody's going to speak forth, I will move to thanking Mark for his wonderful presentation and to thank all of you for joining actually. And I really hope together we might be able to take this idea of a Indigenous Science Network and Indigenous knowledge further and make it better known around Australia, if not around the world. Thanks very much, Mark. Great session.
No problem. Great having the opportunity to do it. Thanks a lot. It's been really good. And have a look at all the links that are already being posted in the chat box, and I'll get my presentation out to you all so you can follow that up. Thanks a lot, everyone. Really enjoyed it.